As I said, our speaker today is Ajay Heble from the School of English and Theatre Studies at the University of Guelph. Now, soon after taking this position, we were just trying to figure this out 34 years ago, after doing his doctorate at the U of T in English, this scholar and wonderful jazz pianist went about founding the award-winning Guelph Jazz Festival and its accompanying annual academic colloquium. And while serving as the festival's artistic director for over 2 decades, he also began a very important venture, which was actually instrumental in creating a new academic field, that of improvisation studies. You see, though Ajay began and was very well respected as a scholar of Canadian literature, he soon expanded his academic focus to bring in jazz and improvisation, and especially the social and ethical implications of both of those. His landmark study entitled Landing on the Wrong Note, Jazz, Dissonance, and Critical Practice is only one of over a dozen books he has written and edited in this area. He's also the co-founder and co-editor of Critical Studies in Improvisation, which is the first academic journal in this new field. Not surprisingly, then, he was awarded the 2023 Killam Prize in the Humanities. But what I want to talk about today is something else. It's the fact that Ajay has done something different. He's actually changed how the Canadian Academy can think about doing research, how it can conceive of the relationship between the university and the community, and beyond that, between the arts and public policy. He consciously set about to create a new model to bring town and gown together, something we as academics are always seeking but rarely find. In 2007, he put together a large-scale, multi-university, interdisciplinary, collaborative project entitled Improvisation, Community, and Social Practice. This was awarded a $2.5 million major collaborative research initiatives grant, that's a mouthful, from SSHRC. He then created not only a transdisciplinary teamwork structure of some 35 international Canadian scholars and Canadian scholars, but also a community partnership-based one. This visionary model brought together scholars, students, artists, community organizations, and art presenters to study improvisation as a real force for social change. Now, in 2013, he received a SSHRC partnership grant to set up the International Institute for Critical Studies in Improvisation, which he directed until retiring just this September. This was a capstone achievement for him, but also for the field, for it firmly established the new discipline not only in the Canadian academic world, but also simultaneously in the larger public community. Ajay has been able to bring together students at all levels, fellow scholars from multiple disciplines, and most importantly and innovatively, community organizations. As Eric Lewis, director of McGill's Institute for the Public Life of Arts and Ideas, put it, I quote, "Many worldwide now look to Ajay and his research networks as a model to emulate to bring about positive social change grounded in rigorous research standards and practices and inclusive in vision," end of quote. Ajay sees in improvisation a great ethical potential for social change. In his own words, for creating, and I quote, "new, unexpected, and productive co-creative relations among people." He uses improvisation to build as well as to serve communities, especially working with at-risk youth, children with disabilities, and patients in addiction treatment or mental health facilities. His work thus promotes our core Canadian beliefs, and I'm sorry to stress this at this moment, but our core Canadian beliefs in diversity, equality, and cooperation. And it does so through what we could call research in action. In other words, communal jazz improvisation is not just a metaphor for social interaction, it's an actual model for Ajay and his team, who consistently unite rigorous humanities scholarship with social engagement. It is therefore with considerable anticipatory pleasure then that I ask you to join me in welcoming Ajay Heble to speak to us on the determination to care, festivals, pedagogy, community. Ajay?
Thank you very much, Linda, for that lovely introduction and for this invitation. It's great to be here speaking with you. So yes, my talk is called The Determination to Care, Festivals, Pedagogy, Community. Part 1, Surviving the Upheaval. There's a story about Franz Kafka that's in popular circulation. In its various iterations, it's captivated the attention and sparked the imagination of readers over the years, and it's even the subject of a children's book. Perhaps you've already heard it. Franz Kafka, one version of the story goes, encountered a little girl in the park where he went walking daily. She was crying. She'd lost her doll and was desolate. Kafka offered to help her look for the doll and arranged to meet her the next day at the same spot. Unable to find the doll, he composed a letter from the doll and read it to her when they met. Please do not mourn me. I've gone on a trip to see the world. I will write to you of my adventures. This was the beginning of many letters. When he and the little girl met, he read her from these carefully composed letters the imagined adventures of the beloved doll. The little girl was comforted. When the meetings came to an end, Kafka presented her with a doll. She obviously looked different from the original doll. An attached letter explained, "My travels have changed me." Many years later, the now grown girl found a letter stuffed into an unnoticed crevice in the cherished replacement doll. In summary, it said, "Everything that you love, you will eventually lose. But in the end, love will return in a different form." It's a touching story. I've been taken with it ever since I first heard it. I've read that Kafka apparently put as much time, effort, and care into creating these letters for the little girl as he did into crafting his own writing. Moreover, in the kindness and compassion that Kafka provides to the inconsolable stranger, there is, I want to suggest, a story about the very practice of care. I'm thinking about care as it's been described by Christoph von Barl, Philip Cervera, and Helena Grahan in Stranger Than Kindness, their editorial for the On Care issue of the journal Performance Research. They suggest that the care involves, and I'm quoting, the creation of spaces and ways of belonging, relating to humans and non-humans, and seeking intimacy and a sense of connectedness so that we can survive the upheaval. Care in this improvisational encounter, this sense of connectedness in the park between Kafka and the little girl, manifests itself as an act of relationship building in public space. A gesture, as it were, to help survive the upheaval of loss. I wanted to begin with this story of Kafka and the doll, this act of care, because it might offer a useful way to conceptualize some of the challenges and opportunities that confront us as we seek to carve space for more meaningful connections with others and to generate and sustain possibilities for more caring collective futures. Now, I wouldn't be overstating the case to say that in these troubled times in which we live, the practice of care is urgently needed. Our world is one in which carelessness reigns, suggest Andreas Chudasakis, Jamie Hakim, Joe Littler, Catherine Rottenberg, and Lynn Siegel at the outset of their 2020 book, The Care Manifesto, The Politics of Interdependence. Writing collectively under the name The Care Collective, the authors argue that, and I quote, "The crisis of care has become particularly acute over the last 40 years, as governments accepted neoliberal capitalism's near ubiquitous positioning of profit-making as the organizing principle of life. It has meant systematically prioritizing the interests and flows of financial capital while ruthlessly dismantling welfare states and democratic processes and institutions," end of quote. Indeed, you don't need to look far to see the far-reaching and often devastating consequences of this reign of carelessness, whether it's in the rhetoric, actions, and policies of our elected politicians, or in the apathy, disinterest, or denial that seem to characterize the everyday spaces and places where so many of us live and work. Carelessness seems to be pervasive. In such a context, what might it mean for research, performance, and pedagogy to be treated as acts of care? how might we, as teachers, scholars, artists, and activists, create the conditions that would make fulfilling and expansive practices of care more possible? In my talk today, I want to offer some reflections on how artists, academics, and activists might handle the mandate to perform with care. I'll share some ideas with you about care as a common thread that runs throughout my work as an educator, as a festival organizer, and as a scholar in the field of critical studies and improvisation. I'm interested in how best as arts presenters, educators, and community-based activists, we can participate meaningfully in enabling generative forms of community making, critical thinking, and social practice. What might it mean, I want to ask, to recognize the work we do at our festivals, in our classrooms, and with our communities as a vital form of activist arts-based practice and a pedagogy of care? The relations of care enacted in that story of Kafka, the little girl and the traveling doll, it's worth recalling, are set into motion through an improvisational encounter in the park. And I'd suggest that the setting is indeed important. The authors of the Care Manifesto tell us that public spaces are crucial for building caring communities because they are egalitarian and accessible to all and can foster conviviality, interconnections, and the emergence of communal life. If public spaces, such as parks, are vital in creating the conditions for relations of care to flourish, then are there other places, other spaces in our culture where we might cultivate to enhance our capacities to care? Or to put the question slightly differently, where, as Sarah Evans and Harry Boyd ask in their book, Free Spaces, The Sources of Democratic Change in America, where are the places in our culture through which people sustain bonds in history? What are the processes through which they may broaden their sense of the possible, make alliances with others, develop the practical skills and knowledge to maintain democratic organization? I strongly believe that music festivals can offer one such place in our culture where we might broaden our sense of the possible. During my 23-year stint from 1994 to 2016 as the founding artistic director of the Guelph Jazz Festival, a festival devoted to experimental jazz and creative improvised music, I had the opportunity to reflect deeply on the ways in which institutional frameworks shape not only what we listen to and how and where we listen, but also the very ways in which we negotiate and construct meaning. The work I've done over those years as a festival organizer has prompted me to ask important questions, questions such as, who has the institutional power to determine what counts as knowledge, as history, as music, and what gets disqualified as noise? In what ways is that power connected to broader structures of social control? And how might curatorial practices fuel the creation of spaces and places of connection, possibility, and care? Now, in asking such questions, I intend a certain indebtedness via the work of Paulo Freire and others, to the principle of demythologizing. That is, the need to put critical pressure on some of the assumptions, languages, histories, and narratives that are too frequently promulgated by dominant pedagogical practices and institutional frameworks. So this need to question those positions that get taken for granted. But alongside offering such critical prompts, festivals, I want to suggest, can also provide an important testing ground for alternative ways of being in the world. They can, as David Picard and Mike Robinson argue in their book on festivals and social change, they can generate symbolic adaptations and alternatives to existing states. They go on to argue that the festival needs to be linked to the wider sociological, economic, and political context of change as a site to adapt, reconstruct, and reenact meaningful narrations of collective being in the globally enlarged world. Furthermore, they say, festivals draw our attention because they provide moments of time and space to reflect upon our being in the world and questions of collective meaning and belonging. Expanding on recent work in curatorial theory and museum studies, Black feminist music scholar Daphne Brooks in her recent book entitled Liner Notes for the Revolution, makes a related set of claims about curation as a form of culture making. Writing specifically about Black women musicians, she coins the phrase sonic curation to refer to practices that aesthetically engage and invoke the historical, social, and political ideas and conditions that inform the musical work in question. Sonic curation, she says, involves arranging an experience that moves beyond the musical work itself, creating a sphere of alterity and possibility not unlike the best and most transformative exhibits that one might attend. Although Brooks isn't writing directly about festivals, her comments about the vital and transformative curatorial work performed by Black women's sonic practices are particularly resonant in the context of the arguments I'd like to advance about the work that music festivals can do in the world. Broadening our sense of the possible, creating a sphere of alterity and possibility, generating symbolic adaptations and alternatives to existing states, time and space to reflect upon questions of collective meaning and belonging, staging and narrating collective being in the globally enlarged world. These are pretty large claims, I admit, and they constitute rather a tall order for festivals and for those of us who curate them to fulfill. But I've deliberately put such claims on the table here because they offer a compelling commentary on the role that festivals can play in activating diverse energies of care, critique, and inspiration, and of the difference they can make and have made in their communities by creating time and space to sound and to stage new forms of social organization. And this, I want to suggest, is no small matter. Part 2, curating for change. What then is the work that festivals do in the world? The question deliberately riffs on the title of critic and educator Doris Sommer's important book, The Work of Art in the World. By offering such a prompt, I want to call attention to a particular vision of festivals that builds on some earlier work that I've done and that takes its primary cue and inspiration from creative and critical practices that seek to define broader pedagogical priorities in terms of an activist and community-based orientation. Doris Sommer, in a turn of phrase that seems akin to the comments about sonic curation that I quoted earlier from Daphne Brooks, says that what might begin as an artistic practice doesn't necessarily stop there. It can, as she says, ripple into extra artistic institutions and practices. I take my cue also from the work of the late Bell Hooks, in particular from her book, Teaching Community, A Pedagogy of Hope, in which she says that pedagogy is more than just what happens in the academic classroom. Schooling, she says, is always part of our real world experience. It's a quote I take very seriously. Schooling is part of our real world experience. We need, she says, to see teaching and learning as taking place constantly. So enlarging on such prompts, I turn to festivals to spark consideration of how alternative pedagogical institutions can function in our communities and with what impact. Now, as I said earlier, we know that cultural institutions play a powerful role in inculcating prescribed values and behaviors, in mediating and directing flows of information, in perpetuating established networks of power and dominant systems of thinking, and defining our very frameworks of understanding. In this context, the energy, the spirit, and the agency that's demonstrated in the alternative institution building strategies of independent, artist-run, or sometimes what are called boutique music festivals, I believe, deserve our respectful attention. So today I want to suggest that festivals, and I'm thinking about music festivals in particular, are resonant, if largely under-acknowledged sites for advancing social justice and for enacting relations of care through the arts. I'm interested in how best, as arts presenters, we can build the curatorial capacities of our organizations so that they can participate meaningfully in enabling generative forms of community making, critical thinking, and social practice. What might it mean to ask, I want to ask, to consider festival organizers as community-based educators and activists, to understand festivals as alternative pedagogical institutions, to recognize the work we do at our festivals as a vital form of activist, arts-based practice and a pedagogy of care. I'll argue that festivals are not simply about programming. Rather, they are complex sites for practicing the social, for enacting relations of care. They're public-facing pedagogical interventions that frequently question static relations of power, that seek to build alternative models of community and social cooperation, and often explicitly set out to challenge taken for granted representations. Curatorial decisions, in other words, are far from neutral. They involve choices that are connected in complex ways to broader struggles over resources, identity formation, and power. And while the curation of an arts-based festival might begin with thoughts and insights about programming, the ways in which the curatorial role will, again, borrowing from Doris Sommer, ripple into extra artistic institutions and practices, that is, into an activation of diverse energies of engagement, care, and inspiration. This is a core concern in the construction of my own critical framework in the discussion that follows. The roots of the word curation offer an important clue, I think. They give us a sense of what's at stake in the work that festivals do in the world. Curation, I note, is linked with the word cure. It's derived from the late 14th century curation, curing of disease, restoration to health, from Old French curation, treatment of illness, from Latin curatio, a taking care, attention, management. Indeed, as the Indian interdisciplinary theater artist Amitesh Grover writes, at the core idea of curation lies the determination to care, to protect the intrinsic value of artistic expression, to be attentive to the ways of seeing, to look after the ecology of public space. Curating a festival is to bring a constellation of works together and explore how they seek affiliations with each other in ways their original creators might not have imagined or foreseen. So to be attentive to ways of seeing, to look after the ecology of public space, the determination to care, to cure. Again, ambitious claims, substantial matters. And whether or not festival organizers see their efforts as intentionally or determinedly addressing these kinds of matters, of participating in this act of caring, this kind of curing, the extra artistic ripple effects and provocations that are prompted by curatorial acts can lead us to many unexpected and oftentimes urgent findings that encourage us to think anew about the work that festivals can do in the world. Now, I've been talking about festivals pretty generally, but I want to take just a bit of time to zoom in on festivals of improvised music in particular, which is my area of expertise. But before I do that, I want to acknowledge that the kinds of claims I'm making about festivals as sites for intervening actively in debates about care and collective belonging are not necessarily a comfortable fit for all, or perhaps even most, arts organizations. Indeed, I would guess that for many large-scale corporate-run festivals, for example, the notion that arts presentation should in any way be likened to such activist priorities or principles might seem a far stretch. In her analysis of the rise in popularity of urban arts festivals, for example, tourism geographer Bernadette Quinn suggests that there's in fact a tendency to neglect the social value of festivals in favor of an emphasis on economic outcomes. Fair enough. When I've sat around the table with other jazz festival organizers, as I've done on numerous occasions, there is very little, if any, explicit attention given to social concerns, to matters of care, diversity, belonging, social cooperation, or for that matter, to anything like the need to unsettle dominant or institutionalized narratives or histories. That doesn't really come up in our conversations. If and when these sorts of matters are touched upon, they come up primarily and inevitably in the context of the need to fulfill certain requirements on grants, or rather than as core ways of thinking about programming. Given that there's a long and illustrious history of creative practitioners who've used the practices of improvisation and collaboration as ways to sound off against systems of fixity and oppression, to enact their own relations of care, it is perhaps no surprise that festivals whose mandate involves the curation of improvised music are, in fact, often explicit in articulating the broader social concerns. About the Guelph Jazz Festival, for example, I often used to say, of course it's about the music, yes. But for me, it was about so much more than that. For me, it was also about reinvigorating public life with the spirit of dialogue and community. In a recent short video, cultural theorist and poet Fred Moten makes a related point specifically about the Vision Festival. The Vision Fest is New York's preeminent celebration of free jazz and creative improvised music. The music, says Moten, continues to give us an example of how we ought to be. And at the Vision Fest, he continues, people can come together under the protection and by way of the inspiration of this music. And the music has an ethics that's already embedded in its own production. It becomes a lesson for us about how to live together. If we think about festivals as testing grounds that teach us, as Moten puts it, about how to live together, then this experience of staging difference and diversity in public spaces can, I think, be a vital curatorial catalyst for promoting relations of care and connectedness. In this context, I continue to be particularly interested in reflecting on the question of how, as arts presenters, we might play a role in encouraging what the improvising trombonist and scholar George Lewis has called an interculturalizing of the field. That is, in terms of the range and scope of cultural references that the field, in this case, I'm thinking of the field of innovative jazz and creative improvised music. So thinking about this in terms of the range and scope of cultural references that the field takes on. At the Guelph Jazz Festival, I've deliberately sought over the years to interculturalize the field by bringing together ad hoc groupings of improvising artists from diverse cultures. Much of the music that I've curated involves precisely these sorts of real-time improvisational encounters. So let me play you one example now.
Sen
Thank you to Mike for the tech, Michael for the tech. So the musicians in this video came from Ethiopia, Mali, Mexico, the Netherlands, Canada, and the United States. There was no one language that they all spoke in common. They had never met before they came on stage together. So think about what's happening in this context. A group of people who've never met, who in many cases know very little, if anything, about one another, who in this case didn't speak a language in common, are able to come together on the spot with no prearranged musical direction, right? They didn't sit down beforehand and say, okay, we're gonna play in the key of C, or we're gonna play in this mode or whatever. They just came together in front of an audience for the first time, and they created this wondrous, in my mind, wondrous music with no prearranged musical direction. So what might this tell us? What does this tell us about what it means to negotiate difference in the context of community? What does it tell us about trust, about social obligation, about listening, really learning to listen to what's going on around you? So these are some of the kinds of questions I was interested in. And I think, there's a lesson for us that we might learn from these improvisational encounters that happened during the festival about how best we might get along in a globalized world. So, we might ask, how does this interculturalizing of the field, the staging of diversity that's taking place during a festival, how does that make a real difference when so much of the world population seems to be deemed disposable, when new and more virulent racisms are rearing their ugly heads and borders are being closed against fleeing bodies who are seeking refuge? In what ways might the curation of music festivals in any meaningful way intervene in our understanding of and offer a response to conflict and war, to issues of migration, refugees, and borders? Now, it's tempting to think about festivals as sites that remove us from the concerns of the work and workings of the everyday, right? It's tempting to do that, but somehow, I think it's tempting to think that festivals create spaces and places that are somehow separate from our daily lives. But I'm more inclined to think about festivals in relation to what the social legal scholar Davina Cooper calls everyday utopias. Everyday utopias, she says, don't place their energy on pressuring mainstream institutions to change, on winning votes, or taking over dominant social structures. Rather, they work by creating the change they wish to encounter. Festivals, understood in that context, involve not necessarily a removal from the everyday, but rather an enactment of the possibilities we envision. Cooper's notion of everyday utopias is attuned to such transformational possibilities. As practiced performances of other ways of living, she says, they form richly productive and important sites for social change politics, even as they reveal the compromises, accommodations, and practical dilemmas of counter-normative ways of living. The presentation of improvised music in a festival setting certainly involves its fair share of compromises and accommodations, and I certainly wouldn't want to underestimate the huge role that material constraints and conditions play in shaping the music. After all, the everyday realities of fundraising, marketing, ticket revenues, production costs, among others, are always going to be there as contexts and constraints to be taken into consideration when putting on a festival. Of course, I'd be remiss as an arts presenter not to take them into account. But as I reflect on the ways in which and the extent to which festival organizers might try to break the tutelage of dominant institutions, as I make the case that festivals can be understood as activist sites for enacting relations of care, I'm put in mind of a comment made by the authors of Legible Practices, a book about social innovation and the Rewiring of Institutions, written under the auspices of the Helsinki Design Lab. They've said that culture is the ultimate engine of scale for any innovation in society. Without changing cultural values and meanings, they say it's difficult, if not impossible, for social relationships to propagate or for new approaches to flourish. The argument I'm attempting to rehearse is that this kind of large-scale change in cultural values necessarily takes place within a multidimensional field of understanding. The curation of improvised music in a festival, in other words, may not in and of itself necessarily create such change, may not directly address the global crises in which we find ourselves. However, once we begin to theorize and practice arts presentation within the context of broader social change discourses and movements, the transformative potential of this work, I want to believe, can take on a new shape. Let me return for a moment to the Jazz Festival, the Guelph Jazz Festival. As Linda mentioned, in 1996, in an effort to bring together my community interests and involvement with my academic work, I started organizing a scholarly conference as part of the festival, as part of the festival's regular schedule of events. Since then, and for over 2 decades now, we've been running what has become an annual international conference as part of a jazz festival. It's the first ongoing scholarly event of its kind to be linked to a North American jazz festival. And it's been bringing together scholars, creative practitioners, and audiences for vibrant and inspired critical exchanges. It also significantly has led to the formation of those projects that Linda mentioned, the Improvisation Community and Social Practice Project and the International Institute for Critical Studies in Improvisation, each of which has played a key role in shaping a brand new field of intellectual inquiry. Now, as part of these projects and building on that Guelph model of partnerships between music festivals and universities, we're running satellite conferences in cities such as Montreal, Vancouver, St. John's, Regina, Paris, France, Athens, Greece, and Mexico City. We also have our own book series with Duke University Press, a peer-reviewed academic journal, and students and postdoctoral fellows getting jobs in a scholarly field that we've in effect helped to create. That field building and community building I'm describing have set something in motion that I certainly couldn't have predicted when I started that jazz festival all those years ago. Little could I have imagined that I would found and direct an institute dedicated to a brand new field of scholarly inquiry. But herein, I think, lies a tale of capacity that has been unleashed through cross-sectoral and multidimensional forms of collaboration. Part 3, making something happen. To the extent that Guelph now plays host to a festival that's internationally lauded as a vital agent of change, it's important to recognize that the Guelph Jazz Festival is more than just a festival. It's part of a broader field, I would argue, of social and cultural understanding in which experimental and improvised practices are at the core. And importantly, what may have begun as artistic practice, as Dora Summer says, doesn't stop there. It has rippled out into extra artistic institutions and practices. So all this to say, the institute that I've directed, the International Institute for Critical Studies in Improvisation, and the scholarly field of study that it's helped to formalize, really began with the work that I started with the Guelph Jazz Festival. And through our work with the Institute, we've essentially sought to test the hypothesis that improvisational artistic practices can provide vital lessons about social cooperation and community building, about possibility, connection, and care. If improvised music's ability to imbue the world with possibility is evident in the kind of musical examples I've touched on here from my work with the festival, that sense of possibility is also powerfully registered in several long-standing community-engaged research projects that have been associated with our institute. Over the last 15 years or so, we've worked with improvising musicians to develop a number of community engagement initiatives in partnership with music festivals and in partnership with social service organizations in several cities around the world. Our research makes clear that these initiatives have played a vital role in helping to foster vibrant, cohesive, and caring communities with at-risk urban youth populations, patients at mental health addiction treatment facilities, and residents of some of Canada's poorest neighborhoods. Our students have documented the events, they've conducted follow-up interviews, And we know from the interviews that these events we put on have genuinely touched people's lives and reached populations who rarely get a chance to shine. We've seen firsthand how improvisation enables new models of care and cooperation, and how it fosters vibrant, cohesive communities while increasing self-esteem, self-confidence, leadership, and social skills. I'd like briefly to zoom in on one example, community project called Play Who You Are. It's been running since 2007 in partnership with Kids Ability Center for Child Development, which is a social service organization that runs programs for kids with physical and developmental disabilities, and also with the Guelph Jazz Festival. Through this partnership, we've been bringing world-class improvising musicians into creative collaboration with children and youth with special needs. The musician facilitators lead workshops that help to develop the youth's musical skills, confidence, and repertoires. And the group then works together to stage a public performance during the Guelph Jazz Festival, most often at one of the festival's biggest venues, an open air stage where there are often thousands of people. Ongoing research by members of our team has explored a range of topics, including short and long-term impacts of improvised arts participation, pedagogical approaches to teaching improvised music in community settings, the therapeutic role of improvised creative practices, and the impact of improvisation programming on community cohesion. It's clear to us, indeed, that the impacts of the workshops and the performances have been numerous, with research we've been conducting over the years highlighting several key themes. These include self-esteem, self-expression, self-confidence, an increased ability to listen and to focus, and a sense of group cohesion. Notably, many of the youth who participate in this program also take on spontaneous leadership skills, which is something we hear from the parents and the staff. They very rarely see. The youth are willing to get up in front of an audience of thousands of people and take on, for example, the leadership skill of conducting the whole band and shaping what the music will be in that performance. To mark and celebrate the 10-year history of that Play Who You Are project, in 2017, our institute commissioned a series of short films. We called them Stories of Impact. And these featured some of the alumni who participated in the project over the years. The films were screened during our international conference, the Guelph Jazz Festival Colloquium, which I mentioned earlier, in front of an audience which included parents, families, youth, staff from Kids Ability, festival goers, as well as our international conference delegates. So now I'd like to play you a short film about Katie, who is an alumni of the Play Who You Are initiative. So this is Stories of Impact, Katie.
Have always sought out musical experiences for Katie because early on when she was a small child, she showed us that she's very motivated by everything auditory. I'm Barb Sellers, Katie's mom. Katie has autism and developmental delay. She has a lot of difficulty accessing language. She picks up an object, and the first thing she does is try to find out what kinds of sounds that she can make with it.
I missed her name. Katie? Okay. Hi, Katie. I'm Jesse. Hi. Hi, Katie. Hi. Welcome to our music circle here.
Initially, Katie was uncertain about it, and then, of course, the instruments were there, and the engagement of the artists who came with such open hearts, you know, and open ideas about how to make this work for our kids, never having done it before. And every year was different. And each year, Katie went in with a more positive feeling than she did the year before. Like that comes from being in and among people who make her feel accepted, welcome, included, valuable, someone worth listening to.
We'd like to do this piece with Katie.
I was sitting in the audience and I wasn't sure how my daughter would react, and to see her rise to that occasion was astounding. For that moment, I could see Katie's joy. So Katie will be 22 in October, and we are falling off a cliff in some ways. Right, so carrying those memories forward brings a whole world of possibilities to a person like Katie, instead of limitations. And Katie's world is full of limitations. And ICAST was full of the what we can do and not what we can't do. Here we are, at 22, and Katie feels that she can. Every time I take Katie somewhere and she gets up, I watch the people in the room, and some of them give me the disapproving eyebrow, and other people's eyes are wide open. Next thing you know, somebody else is getting up and doing a jig. What is that? That's what it's all about.
So in this Stories of Impact film, Katie's mother, Barbara, talks about how improvisation has opened up a whole world of possibilities for her daughter. But despite her appreciation of the possibilities, Barbara is also forthright in reminding us that Katie's world is full of limitations. Her comments about limitations are important. It reminds us that for all its potential as an agent of social change, improvisation won't always succeed in triumphing over adversity. What we've learned from our years of research with the Play Who You Are initiative, as indeed with so many of our community-based projects, is the importance of cultivating relations of care, of nourishing opportunities for change, of giving the seemingly impossible a chance, even as our projects take us into spaces and places where there will continue to be complex negotiations, contradictions, compromises, challenges, and limitations. That sense of care, that world of possibilities, is often revealed not so much in large-scale or spectacular transformations, but rather in what Elizabeth Jackson, our Institute's former community engagement officer, referred to as small, fleeting moments, unpin-downable interactions, flashes of eye contact, the smile on the face of a very unexpressive child. Think back then to one of the questions I raised at the outset. How might we, as teachers, scholars, artists, and activists, create the conditions that would make fulfilling and expansive practices of care more possible? As I reflect on this partnership with Kids Ability, as well as on my work with the Guelph Jazz Festival, I've come to realize a perhaps obvious, if underappreciated, point. To borrow Christoph von Barl, Philippe Cervera, and Helen Grahan's words from their Stranger Than Kindness editorial, putting the effort into making something happen, whether it is a text, a lecture, a meeting, a theater or dance performance, can actually be essential to developing relations of care. If, as community-based researchers, we aim to not simply to transmit conventional models of academic knowledge via what Freire famously called the banking method of pedagogy, but instead to make something happen, we will perforce reach new audiences, invite broader forms of public participation and inquiry, generate new relations of care. I've tried to carry many of these same principles about making something happen, reaching new audiences, generating relations of care into my teaching practices. Drawing on the work of bell hooks and other theorists of critical pedagogy, I share the strong belief that hope resides in our ability as teachers to find innovative ways to make the world our classroom. That is, to create classrooms without boundaries. Like Hooks, I locate a powerful sense of hope in the growing recognition among educators that education necessitates a commitment to taking teaching and learning outside the walls of the structured and formal classroom setting. A recognition, that is, of the extent to which activist practices might be understood as powerful sites of pedagogical intervention. Indeed, over the last several years, my own teaching has become increasingly committed to making links between what we do in the classroom and broader struggles in the public arena. I've sought to develop pedagogical strategies that foster connections between what students learn or do at university and how they come to understand themselves as socially responsible and caring citizens. To that end, I've tried, whenever possible, to design my university courses at all levels, from first year through to PhD, to recognize various forms, to require various forms of community-based learning and research. I've encouraged my students to become aware of pressing issues in their communities and to develop a sense of ethical responsibility for seeking to address these issues. As part of my effort to re-envision schooling as part of our real world experience, to invoke bell hooks again, the final assignment in my courses often takes the form of a proactive community-facing intervention. I challenge my students to move beyond the walls of the classroom in an effort to make interventions in the broader community. I ask that they use these assignments as an opportunity to activate their knowledge, to activate their education. Moreover, and importantly, I urge my students to choose a topic or an issue that they really care about. The response, especially from students, has been overwhelmingly positive. I've documented some of this work in a book called Classroom Action: Human Rights, Critical Activism, and Community-Based Education. Featuring chapters by the students, the book uses a case study approach in which the authors reflect on the activist community-based projects that have emerged from our classroom. In their chapters, the students discuss the opportunities that have been opened up by such projects, and they also considered the institutional obstacles and impediments, and there are many of them, that they encountered throughout the process. What's been particularly encouraging for me is not only the fact that many of the projects they initiate as part of their coursework live on long after the students have left, long after they've graduated, the projects they initiated continue. Right, so that's inspiring in itself, but also that they found ways to encourage replication of their efforts to spark new social justice related initiatives. Needless to say, these sorts of achievements are a tremendous source of pride for me as their teacher. They speak very powerfully to the ways in which university level work can establish a genuine foundation for vital forms of civic engagement and relations of care. So I've touched on 3 examples of my work with you today. I've discussed my role as a festival organizer, a researcher, and a community-based educator. Any one of these areas of inquiry could on their own have filled a talk, right? Could have been the subject of a talk, but by linking them here, I've been able to make explicit the determination to care that drives all of these projects. For me, one key takeaway from the 3 examples is that we need to create structures and conditions in our communities and our classrooms, as well as within the larger institutions in which we work, that can allow us to make things happen. Whether it's through our festivals, with our communities, or in our classrooms, we can indeed put the effort into making something happen. But to create places and ways of belonging requires deliberate effort. To curate with care requires intention. To push up against the reign of carelessness requires fresh new ways of thinking a willingness to take risks, to resist orthodoxy, to trouble settled habits of response and judgment. To survive the upheaval requires imagination. Imagining the world anew, however, we know it's no easy task. It's not always comfortable to let go of what we know and expect, to abandon the tried and true, or to trade the pleasures of certitude and fixity for the surprises that come from ways of knowing, ways of being, and ways of relating that cannot readily be accommodated within received frameworks of assumption. Think back to that story about Kafka, the girl and the traveling doll. It might have been easy for Kafka to ignore the girl's tears, to trivialize her loss. But instead, he took the time and he used his imagination to make something happen, to compose letters from the doll to help the girl cope with her loss, and in so doing, to develop a relationship with the girl that showed he cared about her. Perhaps there's a lesson in there about the responsibility to act creatively, imaginatively in support of others. A lesson about exercising compassion with genuine intent. A lesson that can translate into our own lives in ways that can help us survive the upheaval. Think of it as a call to action, a call to make something happen, to show that we care. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ajay. We're going to take